All right. Now, I've made videos in the past about icing, um, but for this one, I just want you to hear me out. Okay. So, hey everybody, my name is Clay ATC. I'm a certified licensed athletic trainer in the state of Texas. And today I want to talk about some critical thinking when it comes to how long we should be icing for. Oh, kick my stand. So, we've all heard, just ice it, just ice it, just ice it. Ice, frozen water, okay, isn't a new invention for injuries. We know that, okay, everyone knows that. But I want to discuss is a little bit of a different approach, because I've always disagreed with the status quo when it comes to icing an injury, and that is icing for 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes every hour really isn't going to accomplish what you think it's going to accomplish. So it's mainly just going to irritate the skin, um, and you might get a little bit of depth with icing. And I don't believe that heating during the inflammation phase is the best move either. So there's a few things that we have to keep in mind when I talk about icing. There, um, you have to understand when. So that is something that I will talk about later. But just know that I'm talking about the inflammation phase of an orthopedic injury. So most advice online when it comes to icing an injury is to ice for 15 minutes, right? You look up something. I'm injured. I rolled my ankle, sprained my ankle. It says to rice, right? And I've made videos in the past about rice, rest, ice, compression, elevation. So ice for 15 minutes, on and off for 15 minutes, on for 20, off for 20. Every body part, every injury is a standard 15 minutes. Now, I just want us to use our brains for a minute. There are three components that I think of when it comes to orthopedic injury and icing. Okay, so one of them is time, the other is tissue, and the last one is temperature. Okay, so the time is the single most component we need to be concerned with. So the length of time in which we need to ice in order to get the desired effect will vary from body part to body part. So I do not believe that icing a finger, okay, icing your finger should not take the same amount of time as icing your quad. Those are very different structures and very different depths that we're trying to get to. So the next thing that kind of leads me into my second point here is the tissue. So the next thing we need to keep in mind is the target tissue. How deep is that target tissue that we're trying to cool? Let's go back to the finger and quad. Okay, so the finger is about 2 inches in circumference, okay, and less than an inch in diameter. The quad, however, can be anywhere from 15 to 30 inches in circumference, and even bigger in some of these athletes, okay, and more than 6 to 10 inches in diameter. But the advice that you see online is to ice both body parts for the same amount of time and expect the same result. And to me, that just does not add up. Okay, so I just don't think that that math adds up when you talk about the tissue that we're trying to ice and the time that we're trying to spend icing. Okay, so the last thing we need to keep in mind is the target temperature. How many degrees are we wanting to decrease said tissue that we're icing? Okay, we're decreasing the temperature of the tissue. Basically, when the tissue is damaged, temperature increases the oxygen demand, and increased temperature, similar to the fever, and the lack of oxygen, can cause damage to the cells and ultimately lead them to death, and thus increasing the amount of overall damage. So to make it simple, we have the primary injury. Okay, so the primary injury, let's say, is you spraining your ATF in your ankle. So you already damaged that tissue. Okay, you've damaged that ligament, you've damaged those cells. So the contents in that cell then leak out into space, okay, cellular space, and begin to damage healthy cells that are surrounding the area. This is when you start to see increased swelling. You'll see kind of like this choking out of oxygen. So they have lack of oxygen, and this is what we deem to be secondary injury. So the primary injury is the injury that occurred. Okay, there's nothing I can do about that. But I want to try to limit what's called secondary injury. And secondary injury is that lack of oxygen. So you have that hypoxic event. You do have increased temperature, and you have an increased demand for oxygen. So all three of those things we know are going to cause even more cellular death. So with icing, what we're trying to do is lower that in order for the tissue to kind of be in a normal range, if you would. So we're trying to lower the amount of heat, lower the cell's need for oxygen. And that happens through the cooling of the tissues, okay? So you have those three things. So you have time, you have tissue, and you have temperature. So I never give the same advice to athletes, because again, I treat athletes. I never give them the same advice for icing when it comes to the inflammation phase and whatever injury that they sustain. So whether that be an ankle sprain, depending on the person and how big they are, it might be for 30 minutes, it might be for 45 minutes, it might be for an hour. Okay, the quad, same thing. I want to ice for about an hour depending on the injury. For a finger, we can get away with 5, 10, 15 minutes. Okay, for a wrist, same thing, about 15, 20, 25, 30 minutes. But those are all different structures that need different things, and we're treating them the same. And that just doesn't make sense to me. Now, maybe my mindset is outdated. Maybe I'll look later at this post, at my blog post, at this video, and see, then maybe I was wrong, maybe get a good laugh out of it. But I still give the same advice now, and I don't really see that changing a whole lot over the course of the next 10, 20 years, unless something were to magically happen. So I've been giving the same advice and having pretty decent success, so I think we're just going to continue down the same road. But again, my ultimate goal is to limit secondary injury during the inflammation phase. So primary injury has already happened, and there's not much we can do about that. So we just have to be able to put the body in a position to heal the best. So a few caveats here, really, of icing is we did not discuss swelling or the mode of cooling, okay? So we merely touched on the advice that I would give to an athlete about icing using real frozen water and not a gel or chemical cold packs. So please, 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 if you're going to ice, I may even put a disclaimer on this one. It's not intended to treat or diagnose anybody, okay? Gel or chemical cold packs will burn your skin, okay? It's a chemical cold, and that's just not the way physics works. Okay, so we'll talk about a little bit of the physics of icing and how that kind of works to help with injury. So we didn't discuss the mode of cooling. So mode for this post, for this video, is simply going to be frozen water. Okay, frozen water, ice. So I hope this video helped you kind of understand what I'm looking for when it comes to icing. It's really not that difficult. It's not a very new technique. It's not something that I think is this magical thing. It does help, but you have to be willing to do it correctly. And that is something that I fight with the athletes all the time, because they'll leave it on for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and it's like you pretty much just wasted your time. But that's for another time. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.